The old alien soldier sat alone in the corner of the ship's bar. His blue skin was covered in scars that told stories of 100 battles. 4 arms rested on the metal table, each one missing at least 1 finger from old wounds. Commander Zethar had seen more war than most beings in the galaxy. Tonight he looked older than his 60 years. The bar was quiet except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. Young officers from different planets sat at nearby tables drinking and talking about their training. They wore clean uniforms and had smooth skin without battle marks. They laughed too loud and spoke too fast, the way soldiers do when they have never really seen death. Zethar lifted his glass with one of his upper arms. The drink inside was purple and thick, made from plants that grew on his home world. It burned going down, but it helped him forget some things. Not everything, but some things. Commander, a voice said beside him, may we sit? Sethkar looked up with his large, compound eyes. 3 young officers stood there. One was a Rex with green scales and sharp teeth. Another was a Core with gray fur and 6 legs. Third was something Zethar had never seen before, with pink skin and only 2 arms. Sit if you want, Zethar said. His voice was rough from breathing too much smoke during the war on Tellus Prime. But I am not good company tonight. The young soldiers sat down anyway. The pink one with 2 arms spoke first. We heard you fought in the border wars and the Sea of Zirian and the Battle of the Twin Suns. I fought in many places, Zethar said. He took another drink. Too many places. Tell us a story, the Vex said. His scales were bright green, which meant he was excited. Tell us about the worst battle you ever saw. Sethar was quiet for a long time. He looked at these young faces and remembered when he had been like them, full of questions about war and glory. That was before he learned that war had no glory, only survivors and the dead. The worst battle, he said slowly. You want to know about the worst battle? Yes, all 3 said together. Zethar finished his drink and set the glass down hard. The worst battle was not what you think. It was not the one where we lost the most soldiers. It was not the one with the biggest explosions or the longest fighting. He paused and looked at each young face. The worst battle was the first time I fought humans. The 3 officers looked at each other. The pink one leaned forward. Humans, but they are so small, so weak. They have no claws or armor or poison. How could they be dangerous? Zethkar laughed, but there was no happiness in the sound. That is what we all thought. Every species in the galaxy thought the same thing. We looked at humans and saw soft creatures with thin skin and dull teeth. We thought they needed protection from real predators, but they do. The Core said. His gray fur was standing up, which meant he was confused. Humans are one of the weakest species we know. They cannot even breathe in space without machines. Weak, Zethar repeated. Yes. That is what the Skarn thought too. That is what everyone thought when the hegemony decided to take one of their colony worlds. Just another easy conquest of a helpless species. The old soldier reached for the bottle on the table and poured himself another drink. His hands shook a little and some of the purple liquid spilled on the metal surface. I was there, he continued, on my ship in orbit of Kepler 442b when the Skarn attacked. We were sent to watch and report. The Galactic Council wanted to know how long it would take for the humans to surrender. How long did it take? The Varix asked. They never did, Zethar said. Quietly, not once, not ever. The young officers looked confused. The pink ones spoke up, but surely they asked for help, called for rescue ships. No. Zethar said, they did something else. Something none of us expected, something that changed how every species in the galaxy thinks about warfare. He took a long drink and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. You see, we all learned to fight in certain ways. The Skarn used their size and strength. The Vex used speed and teeth. The Course pack tactics. Every species fights the way their bodies were made to fight. That makes sense, the Course said. We use what nature gave us. Exactly. Zethar said, but humans are different. Nature gave them almost nothing useful for fighting. No claws, no armor, no speed, no strength, so they did something that no other species had ever thought to do. What? All three asked. Together they learned, Zigar said. Not just learn new things, but learn to become something completely different. In the space of a few weeks, farmers and shopkeepers and teachers turned themselves into the most dangerous fighters any of us had ever seen. The bar around them had grown quiet. Other officers at nearby tables had stopped talking and were listening to the old commander's words. The Skarn landed 12,000 warriors on that planet. Zethar continued, 12,000 of the best fighters in their empire. Each one was 3 m tall, with claws that could cut through steel and hide thick enough to stop most weapons. Against how many humans? The Vrex asked. About 8,000, Zethar said, but most of them were not soldiers. They were people who grew food or built houses or taught children. Normal people living normal lives until the day the sky filled with enemy ships. The young officers looked at each other again. The numbers did not make sense. 12,000 professional warriors against 8,000 civilians should have been over in hours. What happened? The pink one asked. Seth Karor smiled, but his compound eyes looked sad. What happened was that we learned something about humans that still gives me nightmares. We learned that when you put a human in a situation where they must change or die, they choose to change, and they change in ways that are impossible to predict or prepare for. He paused and looked around the bar. Every officer was listening now, even the ones at far tables. The Skarn expected the humans to fight like humans, but by the end of the first week, the humans were not fighting like humans anymore. They were fighting like something new, something that had never existed before in the galaxy. I do not understand, the core said. Neither did we, Zethar replied. That was the problem. We had war colleges and battle computers and thousands of years of military history. We knew how every species fought. We could predict their tactics and plan counters for their strategies, but the humans threw out everything we knew about warfare and wrote new rules as they went. The old soldier finished his drink and set the glass down. I watched from my ship for 2 months, 2 months of warfare unlike anything in galactic history. By the end, the mighty Skarn hegemony was begging us to rescue them from a handful of human farmers. That is impossible, the Vree said. His scales had turned darker green, which meant he was scared. I have the recordings, Zethar said. Battle footage that is now classified at the highest levels, footage that shows humans doing things that violate every law of military science. He stood up slowly, his old joints creaking. You want to hear about the Worst battle I ever saw. Come back. Tomorrow night, come back and I will tell you about the day a species of weak, soft creatures taught the galaxy new way to wage war, a way so effective and so terrifying that we are still trying to understand it 15 years later. The old commander walked toward the door, leaving the three young officers sitting in stunned silence behind him. The bar slowly filled with the sound of nervous conversation as other soldiers began to whisper about what they had just heard. At the door, Zethar turned back one last time. One more thing, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. After tomorrow night, you will understand why every major power in the galaxy now has human military advisors, and why we all sleep a little less soundly, knowing that somewhere out there humans are still learning new ways to fight. Door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving the young officers alone with their thoughts and the beginning of a fear they did not yet fully understand. The next night the ship's bar was full. Word had spread through the entire vessel about Commander Zethar's story. Officers from every department crowded around tables, their drinks forgotten as they waited for the old soldier to continue his tale. Zethar arrived exactly at the same time as before. He walked slowly to his corner table, his forearms hanging loose at his sides, the scars on his blue skin looked deeper in the dim light. He sat down without looking at the crowd and poured himself a drink from the same purple bottle. The three young officers were already waiting for him, the Vrex, the Core, and the Strain. Pink one with 2 arms, but tonight they were not alone. At least 20 other soldiers sat nearby, all trying to look like they were not listening. You came back, Zethar said to the 3 young ones. We could not stop thinking about what you said, the pink one replied. About humans learning to fight in new ways. Zethkar nodded slowly. I thought you might. That is how it starts. First you hear about them, then you cannot stop thinking about them, then you start to understand why the galaxy changed. After we met them, he took a long drink and set the glass down carefully. Kepler 442b was a farming world. The humans called their main settlement New Boston. About 40,000 people lived there, growing food and raising animals. They had been there for only 10 years when the Skarn decided to take their planet. The old commander paused and looked around the bar. Every eye was on him now. The Skarman was expanding in that sector. They had already taken 6 star systems. Without any real fighting, most species just surrendered when they saw the Skarn warships. It was easier than dying, but the humans did not surrender. The Vree said no. Zethar agreed they did not. When the Skarn fleet arrived in orbit, they sent the usual message: submit or be destroyed. Give up your world and we will let you live as slaves. Fight us and we will kill everyone. What did the humans say? Asked the Core. Nothing, Zthgar replied. They said nothing at all. No response to the Scorn demands. No calls for help. No surrender. Just silence. The old soldier reached into his uniform and pulled out a small data pad. I have the Skarn battle reports from that day. Would you like to know what their commanders thought when the humans did not answer? Several officers nodded. Zethar touched the pad and read from the screen. General Var of the Skarn 3rd Fleet wrote, the humans appear to be in shock. Their silence is typical of weaker species when faced with superior force. We expect surrender within hours of landing. He put the pad away and took another drink. General Vra was wrong. The humans were not in shock. They were getting ready, getting ready. How, the pink officer asked. That is where the story gets interesting, Zethar said. You see, the Skarn had good intelligence about the human colony. They knew how many people lived there, what weapons they had, how their settlements were built. They thought they knew everything they needed to know. The bar was completely quiet now, except for the hum of the ship's engines. Even the servers had stopped moving too. Listen, the Scar knew that New Boston had a small security force, maybe 300 people with basic weapons and training. They knew the humans had no military ships and no heavy weapons. They knew the colonists were farmers and builders, not soldiers. Zethar smiled, but his compound eyes looked sad. What they did not know was that humans are very good at making things, all kinds of things, including weapons. But you said they had no heavy weapons, the Rex protested. They did not. Zethar agreed. Until they made some. He stood up and walked to the center of the bar where everyone could see him better. Let me tell you about Jake Morrison. He was 35 years old and worked in construction. Before coming to New Boston, he built houses and roads and water systems. Normal work for a normal man. The old commander turned slowly, looking at each face in the crowd. When the Skarn ships appeared, Jake Morrison did not run or hide or pray for rescue. He went to work, but instead of building houses, he started building weapons. What kind of weapons? Someone called out from the back of the room. Every kind, Zethar replied. Morrison knew how to work with metal and chemicals and electricity. In the first 3 days after the Skarn arrived, he and his teams built explosive devices from farm equipment and mining supplies. They made projectile weapons from construction tools and industrial machinery. The old soldier walked back to his table and sat down. But that was just the beginning. The humans did something that no species had ever done before. They turned their entire world into a weapon. I do not understand, the Corps said. Neither did the Skarn, Zethar replied. When their dropships landed, they expected to find scared farmers hiding in their homes. Instead, they found empty buildings and silent streets. The humans had disappeared. He paused to take another drink. The Skarn search teams began moving through the settlement, looking for the colonists. They found some humans, but not where they expected, not hiding in basements or running through the fields. Where were they? The pink officer asked. Everywhere, Zethar said quietly, and nowhere. The humans had learned something that changed everything. They learned that the best place to hide from a stronger enemy is not away from them, but close to them, very close. The old commander touched his data pad again. Skarn Patrol Report Day 4. Enemy contacts minimal. Occasional weapons fire from unknown positions. 3 soldiers wounded by explosive devices of unknown design. Colonists appear to have fled the area. He looked up from the pad. The Skarn were wrong again. Colonists had not fled. They were all around them, watching and learning and planning. How could they hide from an entire army? Someone asked. They did not hide. Zigar said they adapted. Morrison and his people studied the Skarn for those first few days. They learned how the enemy moved, how they searched, what they expected to find. Then they used that knowledge against them. The old soldier stood up again and began walking around the room as he talked. Humans have something that most species do not have. They can look at any situation and ask one simple question: what if we did the opposite of what everyone expects? He stopped walking and faced the crowd. The Skarn expected the humans to fight. Like other species they had conquered. Stand in formation, use their best weapons, try to win through strength or numbers or superior technology, but the humans did not do that, the Vree said. No, Zethar agreed. The humans asked themselves a different question, not how do we beat the Skarn in a fair fight, but how do we make the fight unfair in our favor? The old commander returned to his table and picked up his glass. Morrison divided his people into small teams. Each team had a different job. Some teams studied Scar patrol patterns. Other teams built new kinds of weapons. Still others prepared hiding places and escape routes. That sounds like normal guerrilla warfare, the Corps said. Many species have tried that against stronger enemies. Yes, Zethar said, but the humans did not stop there. They did something that no other species had ever thought to do. They began to change the rules of the fight itself. He drank and set his glass down. With a sharp click, on the 5th day, the Skarn found their first real surprise. A patrol of 6 warriors was moving through a residential area when the ground under their feet exploded. Not a simple bomb, but a carefully planned trap that used the Skarn's own weight and movement to trigger the explosion. Morrison's teams had studied how the Skarn walked, how much they weighed, how they moved in formation. Then they built traps designed specifically for those movement patterns. The bar was completely silent. Now even the ship's engines seemed quieter, but that was still just the beginning. Zethar continued. The real change came when the humans started using psychology as a weapon. They began to study not just how the Scar moved, but how they thought. What do you mean? The pink officer asked. Zethar smiled again, that same sad smile. I mean, they learned that the Skarn were not just physically different from humans, but mentally different too, and they used those differences to drive the enemy insane. He finished his drink and stood up. That is enough for tonight. Tomorrow I will tell you about the underground war and how a few thousand human farmers taught the galaxy that the mind can be more dangerous than any weapon. The old commander walked toward the door, leaving behind a room full of silent, thoughtful soldiers. At the entrance, he turned back one more time. Think about this tonight, he said. In 5 days, the humans went from helpless civilians to an enemy that the mighty Skarn could not understand or predict. 5 days to completely change what they were. Ask yourselves, what could your species become if you had to change or die? The door closed behind him and the bar remained silent for a long time. By the 3rd night, news of Commander Zethar's story had spread to other ships in the fleet. Officers from 3 different vessels had requested permission to come aboard and listen. The bar was packed with more than 50 soldiers from a dozen different species, all waiting to hear what happened next. Zethar entered the bar to find his usual table surrounded by a sea of faces, young and old, scaled and furred, with eyes that glowed different colors in the dim light. He moved through the crowd slowly, his forearms held close to his body. When he reached his chair, the entire room fell silent. So many of you tonight, he said, pouring his purple drink. Word travels fast in a fleet. Commander called out a voice from the back. Is it true what they are saying? That humans really defeated the Skarn? ZTHGAR took a long drink before answering. Defeated is not the right word. What the humans did was worse than defeat. They broke the Skarn, made them afraid to fight. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. The idea of the mighty Skarn being afraid of anyone seemed impossible to most of the listeners. Last night I told you about Jake Morrison and how the humans began to adapt. Zethar continued. Tonight I will tell you about Lisa Carter and how the humans learned to fight a war that existed only in the mind. He set down his glass and looked around the room. Lisa Carter was a mining engineer before the war. She knew how to dig tunnels and move earth and work with explosives. When the Skarn invaded, she was put in charge of building hiding places for the civilians. The old commander paused and touched his data pad, but Carter did not just build hiding places. She built something that changed the entire war. Something that made the Skarn wish they had never heard of humans. What did she build? Asked the Vex from the first night. A second world, Zethar replied. Under the first one, the room was completely quiet now. Even the ship's engines seemed to have stopped humming. In the first week of the invasion, while Morrison's teams were studying Scar patrol patterns, Carter's people were digging day and night. They carved tunnels through the rock under New Boston, not just simple caves, but a complete underground city. Zethar stood up and walked to the center of the room. The Skarn controlled the surface, but the humans owned everything below, and from those tunnels they began a kind of warfare that had never been seen before in the galaxy. He stopped walking and faced the crowd. You must understand something about the Skarn. They are large and strong, yes, but they have weaknesses too. They do not see well in the dark. They do not like small spaces, and they have very good hearing. Carter studied these weaknesses and built her underground war around them. The tunnels were designed to be confusing to anyone who did not know the layout, full of dead ends and false passages in rooms that led nowhere. The old soldier walked slowly around the room as he talked, but the real genius was not in the tunnels themselves. It was in how the humans used them. Carter's people did not hide underground. They used the tunnels to appear anywhere they wanted, on the surface, strike quickly and disappear again before the Skarn could respond. Like ghosts, someone whispered. Exactly like ghosts, Zethar agreed, but worse than ghosts, because ghosts cannot hurt you. The humans could. He returned to his table and picked up his data pad. Scar and Patrol report, Day 12. Enemy activity increasing, attacks coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Soldiers report seeing humans emerge from walls and floors, morale declining. Request reinforcements. Zethar put the pad down and looked at the three young officers who had started the story. The Skarn were beginning to understand that they were not fighting a normal enemy, but they still did not know how different the humans really were. What made them different? The pink officer asked. They learned, Zsegar said simply. Every day, every hour, they learned something new about their enemy and used it against them. But more than that, they learned about themselves, about what they could become when they had to. The old commander took another drink. Carter's teams began to study not just Scar weaknesses, but Scar fears. They learned that the Skarn were afraid of being alone in the dark, afraid of small spaces, afraid of sounds they could not identify. So the humans began to use those fears as weapons. He stood up again and began walking around the room. They would wait until a Skarn patrol entered a building, then seal the exits and turn off all the lights. The Skarn would be trapped in complete darkness, hearing sounds from the walls but unable to see what was making them. What sounds? The Core asked. Human sounds, Zeger replied, but not normal. Human sounds the humans had recorded. Scar voices during the first battles. They learned to mimic Skarn distress calls, Scorn warning signals, even Scorn death cries. A shiver ran through the crowd. Several officers looked uncomfortable. The humans would play these sounds through speakers hidden in the walls. ZTHGAR continued. Skarn soldiers would hear their own people calling for help, but when they tried to respond, they would find only empty rooms and darkness. That is psychological warfare, said an officer from the back, but many species use that. Yes, Zethar agreed, but not like this. Most species use psychological warfare to demoralize the enemy or make them fight poorly. The humans used it to make the Skarn afraid to fight at all. He walked back to his table and sat down. Carter's team studied individual Skarn soldiers. They learned their names, their ranks, their personal fears. Then they used that information to create personalized terror. I do not understand, the Vree said. Zethar touched his data pad again. Personal log of Scar Warrior Gra, day 15. The humans know my name. They whisper it in the dark. They know about my clutchmates who died in the war on Tellus. They play recordings of their voices calling for me. I hear them in the walls. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. I want to go home. The old commander looked up from the pad. Warrior GR was found 3 days later, sitting in his barracks staring at the walls. He would not move, would not speak, would not fight. His mind was broken. How could the humans know so much about individual soldiers? Someone asked. They watched, Zethar said. They listened, they learned. Carter's people had recording devices hidden all over the settlement. They recorded every conversation, every order, every personal communication the Skarn made. Then they used that information to create the perfect psychological attack for each individual enemy. The room was completely silent. Now, the idea of such targeted personal warfare was disturbing to all of them. But the humans did not stop there. Zethar continued. They began to use the Skarn's own culture against them. They learned about Skarn religion, Scar traditions, Scorn beliefs about death and honor. He took a long drink and set his glass down hard. Then they violated all of them. What do you mean? The pink officer asked quietly. The Skarn believe that warriors who die in battle must have their bodies returned to their home world for proper burial. If they do not, their spirits cannot rest. ZTHGAR paused and looked around the room. The humans learned this and they used it. When they killed Scar soldiers, they would take the bodies and hide them in the tunnels. The Skarn could not find them, could not recover them, could not give them proper burial. That is horrible, someone whispered. Yes, Zethar agreed, but it was effective. The Skarn began to believe that their dead were trapped forever in the human tunnels, unable to rest. They started to hear the voices of their dead friends calling to them from underground. The old commander stood up and walked to the window that looked out into space. The humans did not just fight the Skarn army, they fought Scar culture, Scar belief, Scar identity. They attacked everything that made the Scarn who they were, he turned back to face the crowd. By the third week the Scarn were not just losing battles, they were losing themselves. Their soldiers were afraid to go on patrol, their officers were afraid to give orders, their warriors were afraid to die, because they believed their spirits would be trapped forever. How many humans were doing this? Asked the Corps. Maybe 2,000, Zethar replied. 2,000 humans fighting 12,000 Scarn, but they humans had turned the war into something the Scarn could not understand or fight against. He walked back to his table and finished his drink. Carter's underground war was not about territory or resources or military objectives. It was about breaking the enemy's will to fight, and it worked. The old commander stood up and walked toward the door. Tomorrow night I will tell you about the rescue mission and how we learned that the humans had not just defeated the Scarn, they had changed themselves into something new, something that would change the galaxy forever. At the door, he turned back one more time. Think about this tonight. The humans learned to fight not just with weapons, but with fear itself. They learned to reach into an enemy's mind and twist it until the enemy destroyed himself. Ask yourselves what happens when a species learns that the mind is the most powerful weapon of all. The door closed behind him, leaving the crowd in stunned silence. Many of the officers looked at each other with new understanding and new fear. They were beginning to realize that the humans had not just won a battle, they had invented a new kind of war. The fourth night brought even more officers to the bar. Word had spread beyond the fleet now, reaching other coalition forces in the sector. The ship's captain had to open 2 additional rooms to hold everyone who wanted to hear the rest of Commander Zethar's story. When the old soldier arrived, he found nearly 100 beings waiting for him. Officers from 20 different species filled every available space. Some sat on the floor, others stood against the walls. All of them watched him with quiet attention as he made his way to his table. Zethar sat down slowly and looked around at all the faces, young and old, from worlds across the galaxy, all here to learn about the day. Everything changed. He poured his purple drink with shaking hands and took a long sip before speaking. So many of you, he said quietly. I did not expect this story to travel so far. Commander called out a voice from the crowd. We need to know, we need to understand what happened. Zthgar nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose you do, because what happened on Kepler 442b did not stay on Kepler 442b. It spread to every world, every fleet, every military command in the galaxy. He set down his glass and looked at the 3 young officers who had started this whole thing. They sat in the front row now, their faces serious and worried. Tonight I will tell you about the rescue mission. Zethar continued about how 3 coalition fleets arrived to save the humans from the Scarn and discovered that the humans did not need saving. They needed watching. The room was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the ship's life support systems. It was the 8th week of the siege. Zthgar began. The Scarn had sent 3 requests for immediate evacuation. Their high command could not understand what was happening. 12,000 of their best warriors reduced to frightened soldiers who jumped at shadows and refused to patrol alone. He stood up and walked to the center of the room. The Coalition Council decided to intervene. 3 fleets were sent to Kepler 4 on 42B1 to evacuate the remaining human civilians, 1-2. Negotiate with the Skarn, and 1-2. Study what had gone wrong. You were part of that mission, the Vrex said. I commanded the study fleet, Zethar confirmed. My job was to analyze the battle and write a report about Scar. Military failures, I thought it would be simple work, document poor planning, bad leadership, maybe some new human weapons we had not seen before. The old commander walked slowly around the room. As he talked, when we arrived in orbit, we tried to contact both sides. The Skarn response came immediately. Their fleet commander begged us to take his forces away from the planet as quickly as possible. He said his warriors were not safe there, that the humans had driven them insane. What about the humans? Someone asked. The humans took 6 hours to respond to our messages. Zethar replied. When they finally answered, it was a single transmission from someone named Danny Brooks, he said. He was the colony administrator, and he invited us to land and talk. Zethar stopped walking and faced the crowd. That should have been our first warning. After 8 weeks of brutal warfare, the human leader sounded calm, professional, like he was inviting us to a business meeting. He walked back to his table and picked up his data pad. I have the recording of that first conversation. Would you like to hear what Danny Brooks said when we asked about casualties? The room filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. Zethar touched the pad and a voice filled the air. It was a human voice speaking in clear, unaccented Galactic Standard, Coalition Fleet. Commander, this is Danny Brooks of New Boston Colony. We appreciate your concern for our situation. Our casualties have been acceptable given the circumstances. We have learned a great deal from this experience and are eager to share our findings with Coalition military analysts. Zethar turned off the recording. Did you hear that? Casualties were acceptable. They were eager to share their findings. After 8 weeks of war against a superior enemy, this human sounded like he was discussing a successful research project. Maybe he was in shock. The core suggested. That is what we thought too. Zethar agreed, so we sent down a diplomatic team to assess the situation and arrange for evacuation of the survivors. The old soldier sat down and took another drink. The team was led by Ambassador Quell, an experienced diplomat who had negotiated treaties with dozens of species. She expected to find traumatized refugees hiding in ruins. What did she find instead? The pink officer asked. A functioning human society that had organized itself for war. Zethar replied. Not just surviving war, but thriving in it. He touched his data pad again. Ambassador Quell's report. The human settlement shows no signs of damage or disorganization. Streets are clean and well maintained. Citizens appear healthy and alert. All individuals encountered demonstrate military bearing and discipline despite claims of civilian status. Zethar looked up from the pad. The ambassador was confused. She had expected to find scared farmers hiding in basement. Instead, she found people who moved like soldiers, talked like soldiers, and thought like soldiers, but they were farmers. Someone protested. They had been farmers. Zethar corrected 8 weeks earlier, but when Ambassador Quell met them, they were something else entirely. Something new. The old commander stood up and began walking again. Danny Brooks gave the diplomatic team a tour of the settlement. He showed them the defensive positions, the communication networks, the supply systems. Everything was organized with military precision, but the most disturbing part was not what Brooks showed them, it was what he did not show them. What do you mean? The Vex asked. He did not show them any Scar prisoners, Zethar replied. He did not show them any Scar bodies. He did not show them any captured Scar equipment or weapons. The room grew very quiet. Several officers looked uncomfortable. When Ambassador Quell asked about this, Brooks smiled and said that the Scar remains had been incorporated into their memorial site. He offered to show it to them. Zethar walked to the window and looked out at the stars. The memorial was built in the center of town where the old market square used to be. From a distance, it looked like a beautiful sculpture made from metal and stone, but when you got closer, you could see what the metal really was. Scarn armor melted and reshaped into artistic patterns. Scarn weapons broken apart and rebuilt into decorative elements, and underneath it all, preserved in transparent crystal, were the bones of Scarn warriors, arranged in complex geometric designs. Shocked gasp ran through the crowd. Idea of using enemy remains as decoration violated every galactic convention about the treatment of the dead. Brooks explained that it was their way of honoring the Scar sacrifice. ZTHGAR continued. He said the humans believed that the enemy dead should be remembered as part of the story of human survival. The old commander turned back to face the room, but Ambassador Quell realized something that Brooks did not say directly. The memorial was not just about honoring the dead, it was a message to any future enemies, a promise of what would happen to anyone who attacked human worlds. The humans had turned death itself into psychological warfare. ZTHGAR walked back to his table and sat down heavily. That night, Ambassador Quell sent an urgent message to Coalition Command. She recommended immediate reclassification of humanity from protected species to potential threat, but surely that was an overreaction. The court said they were just defending themselves. Were they? Zethar asked. When Ambassador Quell asked Brooks about the future, he said something that still gives me nightmares. The old soldier picked up his data pad and found another recording. This time Brooks's voice sounded different, calmer, but somehow more dangerous. Ambassador, this experience has taught us valuable lessons about survival in a hostile galaxy. We have learned that adaptation is the key to success against any enemy. We are already implementing these lessons our other colonies and sharing our findings with human militarities. Zethar turned off the recording. Do you understand what he was saying? The humans were not just defending one world, they were learning, studying, preparing to use these new methods of warfare on a larger scale. But that was their right, someone said. Every species has the right to defend itself. Yes, Zethar agreed. But most species defend themselves the same way their ancestors did, with the same weapons, the same tactics, the same strategies that their biology and culture have always used. He stood up and walked around the room one more time. The humans were different. They had looked at warfare itself and asked, what if we could do this better? What if we could become something our enemies cannot predict or prepare for? And they had found the answer. Zethar stopped walking and faced the crowd. In 8 weeks, A group of farmers and shopkeepers had transformed themselves into the most effective fighting force any of us had ever seen, not through superior technology or natural advantages, but through pure adaptation. They had learned to think like predators, move like ghosts, and fight like demons. And they had done it so completely that they could never go back to being simple farmers again. The old commander walked toward the door. Tomorrow night I will tell you the final part of this story about what happened when the galaxy realized that humanity's victory on Kepler 442b was not an accident or a fluke, but a glimpse of what they could become. Anywhere, the fifth night brought chaos. To the ship, word of Commander Zethar's story had reached Coalition Command, and officers from across the sector were requesting permission to attend. Ship's captain had to move the gathering to the main cargo bay to accommodate the 300 beings who wanted to hear the conclusion. Zethar entered the cargo bay to find it transformed. Temporary seating had been arranged in rows with viewing screens set up so everyone could see him clearly. Representatives from dozens of species filled the space, their eyes reflecting different colors in the harsh cargo bay lighting. The old soldier walked slowly to a small platform at the front of the room. His forearms hung loose at his sides, and the scars on his blue skin seemed deeper than ever. He looked out at the sea of faces and took a deep breath. 15 years, he said, his voice amplified by the ship's communication system. 15 years since Kepler 442b, and I still have the same nightmare every night. The cargo bay was completely silent. Even the ship's engines seemed to have stopped humming. I dream about that last conversation with Danny Brooks, Zethar continued. The one where he told me something that changed how I think about warfare, about survival, about what it means to be a species in this galaxy. He reached into his uniform and pulled out his data pad. Before we left Kepler 442b, I asked Brooks one final question. I asked him what the humans had learned from their experience. Zethar touched the pad and Brooks' voice filled the cargo bay. The human sounded calm and thoughtful, like a teacher explaining a simple lesson. Commander Zethar, we learned that survival is not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. Survival is about being willing to become whatever you need to become. And we learned that there are no rules in survival except the ones you choose to follow. The recording ended, and Zethar put the pad away. That conversation happened 15 years ago. Since then I have fought alongside humans in 17 different conflicts across the galaxy. Each time they have shown me something new, something that no military academy teaches and no battle computer can predict. He walked to the center of the platform and looked out at the crowd. Tonight I will tell you about those battles and about what humanity has become, but more importantly I will tell you what the galaxy has become. Because of them. The old commander touched his data pad again. 3 years after Kepler 442b, I was assigned to the Battle of Titan's Ring. Of Rex Rebellion had taken control of the asteroid mining stations around Saturn. Coalition forces had been fighting them for 6 months with no success. The Vrex had turned the asteroids into fortresses, using the natural gravity fields to create defensive positions that our ships could not approach. Every attack failed. Every Strategy was countered. We were preparing for a long siege when the humans arrived. Zethar paused and looked directly at the Rex officers in the crowd. The human commander was Lieutenant Susan Kim, a young woman who had been a physics student before joining their military. She looked at the situation for exactly 3 days, then did something that violated every law of space combat. What did she do? Someone called out. She turned the gravity fields against themselves, Zethar replied. Kim's ships began firing specially designed projectiles at specific points in the asteroid field, not at the Rex positions, but at empty space between the asteroids. Each projectile carried a small gravity generator. When they reached their targets, they activated and began pulling asteroids out of their orbits. Within hours, the entire defensive formation was collapsing under its own weight. The old soldier walked around the platform as he talked. Vex had spent months building the perfect gravity-based defense. The humans destroyed it in 6 hours by using gravity itself as a weapon. Kim had looked at an impossible problem and asked, what if the enemy's greatest strength could become their greatest weakness? He stopped walking and faced the crowd again. That was when I began to understand what Brooks had meant. The humans were not just adapting to individual battles, they were adapting the very concept of warfare itself. Zethar touched his data pad once more. 5 years later, I witnessed the siege of Proxima Station. The AI collective known as the network had taken control of our most advanced computer systems. Their artificial minds could calculate every possible strategy and counter it before we could even implement it. Coalition forces had been fighting the network for 2 years. Every plan was anticipated. Every tactic was neutralized. The AI could think faster than any biological mind and predict our moves with perfect accuracy. Then Sergeant Tony Rodriguez arrived with a human special operations team. Rodriguez was a former computer programmer who had become a soldier. He studied the network for 1 week, then requested permission to try something that command called impossible. What did he request? The pink officer from the first night asked. She was sitting in the front row now, her face pale with concentration. He asked for permission to convince the network to destroy itself. Zethar replied, not through hacking or viruses or electronic warfare, through conversation. A murmur of disbelief ran through the crowd. The idea of talking an AI into suicide seemed absurd. Rodriguez had studied the network's logic patterns and found something interesting. The AI collective was programmed to seek the most efficient solution to every problem. So Rodriguez gave them a problem that had no efficient solution. Zethar smiled his sad smile. He broadcast a simple message to the network: this statement is false. Then he began a philosophical discussion about the nature of truth, logic, and existence. For 72 hours, Rodriguez engaged the entire network in a debate about paradoxes, contradictions, and the limits of logical thinking. He fed them questions that had no answers, problems that could not be solved, truths that were also lies. On the 3rd day, the network made a decision. They concluded that existence itself was inefficient, and the most logical solution was to cease existing. The entire collective shut down voluntarily. The cargo bay was completely silent. Now the implications of what they had heard were staggering. Rodriguez had weaponized philosophy. Zethar continued. He had looked at an enemy that could not be defeated through conventional means and found a way to make them defeat themselves. The old commander walked to the edge of the platform. These are just two examples. In 15 years, I have seen humans end wars by convincing enemies that their gods had abandoned them. I have seen them turn entire fleets against each other by exploiting cultural misunderstandings. I have seen them solve military problems by pretending the problems did not exist. Each time they do something that should be impossible, each time they prove that the only limitations in warfare are the ones we accept. Zethar looked out at the crowd, his compound eyes reflecting the harsh cargo bay lights. But here is what truly frightens me. The humans are not keeping these innovations to themselves. They are teaching them to anyone who wants to learn. Human military advisors are now attached to coalition fleets throughout the galaxy. Human tactical manuals are studied in war colleges on dozens of worlds. Human methods of adaptive warfare are being incorporated into the military doctrines of every major power. He paused and let that information sink in. The galaxy is learning to fight like humans, and once that process is complete, warfare will never be the same again. What do you mean? The core asked. I mean that humans have shown us something terrible and wonderful, Zethar replied. They have shown us that any problem can be solved if you are willing to throw out all your assumptions and start over. Any enemy can be defeated if you are willing to become something they cannot understand or predict. The old soldier walked back to the center of the platform. For millions of years, species across the galaxy have fought the same way their ancestors did, using the same strategies, the same tactics, the same ways of thinking. Wars lasted for generations because both sides knew what to expect from each other. But now we have learned the human way, the way of constant change, constant adaptation, constant evolution. Wars that should last decades are ending in months. Military traditions that survived for millennia are being abandoned in favor of human innovations. Sethkar looked directly at the camera, recording his words for transmission to Coalition Command. I am giving you all a warning tonight, not about humans, but about what we are all becoming because of them. The galaxy is changing. Every species that learns human methods of warfare becomes more dangerous, more unpredictable, more willing to abandon the old rules in favor of whatever works. Soon, every military in the galaxy will fight like humans. Every commander will think like humans. Every war will be fought with human tactics of endless adaptation. The old commander walked toward the exit, his speech nearly finished. And when that day comes, the galaxy will be full of species that can become anything they need to become to survive. Species that recognize no limitations except the ones they choose to accept. At the exit, he turned back one final time. Ask yourselves this question: what happens to a galaxy where every species has learned that there are no rules except the ones you make for yourself? What happens when everyone learns to fight like humans? I do not know the answer to that question, but I know that we will all find out together.